All right, welcome to part 5 of our session 3 discussions. And we're going to go into the New Deal and labor on this one. So the New Deal brought about a strong drive for the unions to recruit more members and to increase its power. The drive to power divided American labor, and sometimes violence would break out. We talked about the violence that was going on during the Gilded Age. We have it continuing here during the Depression. The National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act of 1935, gave the workers the right to organize for collective bargaining. The American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, looked to organize skilled workers. The members within the AFL challenged the idea of wanting to organize unions for semi-skilled or unskilled workers, like that of the coal miners, steel, and auto industry. John Lewis, who was president of the United Mine Workers, called for the creation of industrial unions. These unions would represent both skilled and unskilled workers. When the AFL refused to back the plan, Lewis and others formed the Committee for Industrial Organization, the CIO. When the AFL kicked out those unions, they created the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Even with the Wagner Act, labor faced resistance from employers. We don't like the unions doing that, so they faced some problems with the employers. So the workers basically came up with a new approach to deal with this. That would be the sit-down strike. Instead of leaving the factory, the workers would actually occupy the factory and refuse to work. Sit-down strikes were used at General Motors to force them to the bargaining table. These policies drew labor and the Democratic Party together, since it was Roosevelt's New Deal that had allowed them to fight for their rights. Now, it's also during this time that we have a lot of people that didn't really agree with President Roosevelt and the New Deal. There were a lot of critics. Some of these critics were the American Liberty League, organization formed in 1934 by conservative Democrats. The League labeled Roosevelt's AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, as a trend towards fascism to control agriculture. Social Security was said to mark the end of democracy. Lawyers for the American Liberty League challenged the validity of the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act, but in 1937, the Supreme Court upheld its constitutionality, and the League disbanded in 1940. You also have Father Charles Coughlin. He was a very fiery speaker during that time, and radio was the medium he used. Basically, so these people would sit down and listen to him nightly and hear him talk about why he didn't like the New Deal. He was a Catholic priest and was one of the most popular speakers in the history of radio. At first, he supported the New Deal, but then when the Depression didn't end, he went against it. Coughlin formed the National Union for Social Justice, which proclaimed that capitalism was dead and that we should convert to a new economic system like that of fascist Italy. So, interesting choice. You also have Dr. Francis Townsend, who feared that the New Deal did nothing to help the elderly. He proposed the establishment of an old age revolving fund, a plan that the federal government would pay a pension of $200 to every citizen over 65 years old. The person getting that money would have to agree to retire and spend all of the money. So once they got the $200 a month, they had to spend it all. Critics cited that it would bankrupt the Treasury, but Townsend believed that his plan would create jobs for younger workers because older ones would retire. It sounds like a good plan, but a lot of things sound good on paper. Then you also have Senator Huey P. Long from Louisiana, who believed that the New Deal was actually too conservative. He introduced his own program called Share Our Wealth. Like any politician, Long promised something for everyone. He promised every American family would be given a house, a car, a radio, and an income of $2,500. Each young person would get a college education. The elderly would get a pension, and veterans would get their bonuses. And to pay for it all, Long would take the money from the rich. Does that sound familiar? Many believe that Long would be a threat to Roosevelt's reelection in 1936. That threat was removed when Long was assassinated in 1935. Long was a politician in Louisiana. Louisiana is kind of known for its corrupt politics, and for everything that Huey said that was good, he was pretty corrupt, so he was basically kind of assassinated because of a lot of things that he did wrong while being a senator in Louisiana. So, also the New Deal dealt with minorities, or how it worked for the minorities. African Americans did get some gains in the New Deal. Several African Americans were appointed to important positions within Roosevelt's administration. They were called the Black Cabinet, and they gave advice to the president to increase opportunities for African Americans. Mexican Americans suffered during the New Deal. They lost many of their jobs in mining and farming industries because basically a lot of the whites needed jobs, so they would force out the Mexicans and the whites would take over their jobs. So a lot of them returned to Mexico. The Native Americans who were suffering under the Dawes Act, and basically the Dawes Act was trying to make all Native Americans white, taking them away from their tribes, dressing them in white clothing, sending them in white schools, trying to convert them to Americanize them. Roosevelt offered the Indian Reorganization Act that allowed tribal corporations to take over the Dawes Act land allotments and encouraged Native Americans to rediscover their traditional ways, and schools were turned back over to the tribes. The only problem is that these corporations that took over management of the land had become like the whites, so they actually did Americanize, and they basically used their control over tribal land to make themselves rich. So in the election of 1936, basically this was the chance for the American people to let Roosevelt know what they thought of the New Deal. The Republicans nominated Governor Alfred Landon of Kansas, who backed some of Roosevelt's policies, but Landon was also backed by the rich who opposed Roosevelt, who said he was taking the country towards socialism. And as you can see on this map here, he didn't even win his own home state. Landon didn't, so Roosevelt wins by a landslide. Excuse me. So he's reelected in 1936. Takes the oath of office in March of 37. Things seem to be looking better. Everything seems like it's coming back. The industrial production had returned to 1929 numbers. 1 million unemployed had jobs again. So Roosevelt orders cuts to federal spending for public works and projects. The Federal Reserve raises interest rates on loans it makes to banks. In turn, the banks raise interest rates on loans that they give out to businesses. We've lived through this before. We're, in fact, sort of still living through it right now. Our version of it. So along with that, you also have Social Security taking about $2 billion out of the economy. So in the winter of 37 and 38, the country slid back into a recession. The industrial production dropped by 50%. 4 million people lost their jobs, and all the gains made since 1934 were gone. Roosevelt was forced to use deficit spending, also known as basically spending more money than the government takes in. Roosevelt called a special session of Congress and asked for $5 billion in work relief. By June of 38, the economy was recovering, and Congress passed the second AAA Act in 1938 to deal with continuing farm problems. After 1938, basically that was it for New Deal legislation, and the New Deal was done. So it's also during this time where things are going on in the world. Things are starting to get kind of scary. If we go back and look over at Europe, Hitler comes to power in 1933 and is rebuilding Germany. So 1938, he is pushing for, basically he needs more land. He wants to help people, the German people of Czechoslovakia. So basically he says we need more breathing room. So he cuts a deal with the British and he takes over Czechoslovakia. So you have that going on. Fascism is on the rise in Europe. It seems like we were probably heading to another world war, possibly. So it's during this time that a radio show is broadcast on October 30th, 1938 by Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater of the Air. Basically, it ran without commercials. It was the way it was put on was that you figured it was just this musical show, but then you had news break-ins, and basically it was about an hour long, which is how long the radio shows were. And the first 2/3 of this show had simulated news bulletins was suggested, and there was a Martian invasion of Earth. Now, this was based on H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, and what happened was the most popular show during that time was Charlie McCarthy, and basically he was a ventriloquist, and Charlie McCarthy was his dummy, Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, and people listened to that show. And when they went to break, they switched over to CBS to listen to the show, and what they jumped in on was basically the news bulletin saying that the Martians had invaded. This caused a panic. They actually thought the Martians had invaded. So historians calculate that about 6 million people heard the broadcast, 1.7 million believed that it was true, and 1.2 million were genuinely frightened. So people were seeing this invasion as possibly, there was a lot of buildup going on. There was a lot of fear in people wondering if the world was going to go to war. Then all of a sudden you have the Martians invading. So it kind of, this heightened sense made what was supposed to be just a radio show, and what Orson Welles said to make you go boo, it was their attempt at a Halloween show, but it actually kind of affected people differently. But you can see at that time, when you think the world's about to go to war, you are going to have kind of heightened senses about things going on. So that is going to wrap up this part of our discussion. I will be back, and we are going to delve into the Second World War, and it's going to be interesting, and I hope you enjoy it. But the next segment will be about the Second World War. So we'll see you here shortly.